Hi guys, welcome to this new video on my channel. I've been asked many times how to install TYPO3 with Docker and DDEV. How does it work? And because it still seems a bit unclear, I thought I should make a short video on the topic, because it's not that difficult. Let's take a look at it after the intro. If you want to install TYPO3 locally, the recommended method is currently Docker and DDEV. DDEV is a virtualization technology. Maybe you know things like VirtualBox or Vagrant or something like that. Docker is different, but in principle it does something similar. It provides us with a server environment locally on the computer, for example, a web server, a database server, or other technologies. And DDEV is actually just a tool to facilitate the interplay of various Docker images, or rather Docker containers. So if we now want to install TYPO3 with Docker, we need a web server, we need a database server. These are the two most important things. Maybe we need one or two other things that DDEV also brings with it. And of course you could do all of this without DDEV and let it play together, but that's just a bit more complicated, and DDEV makes it easier for us. Okay, but now let's take a look at what you need to use Docker and DDEV, where you can find the information. I'll go to my screen here. And your first point of contact is always ddevreadthedocs.io. This is the DDEV documentation, and it actually contains everything you need to know to install Docker and DDEV on your system. That's why I'm not going to show you how to install it in the video, because it's all described here super well, I think. I've always done this according to this manual. I've also tested it on a Windows computer. I work exclusively on Mac computers myself, but I also tested it on Windows with this WSL2, and that worked wonderfully for me too. You will first find the system requirements here on the start page. You just have to look through whether it fits with you. But usually this shouldn't be a problem on halfway modern computers anymore. Traditional Windows, I don't know now, and Linux is the easiest anyway. You have to say the whole technology is a Linux technology in the end. And it works best on Linux systems. I just work on macOS. That's why I'm now referring to everything I show on macOS, but you can actually do the same on Windows computers. So you go to the Docker installation area for the first time. And here you go to the area of your operating system and just do what it says here. And now a little note, especially for macOS users. You can also install Kollima instead of Docker Desktop, which is the desktop application for Docker. This is a different project, but ultimately does the same. However, Kollima does not have a desktop app where you can make all the settings, but is operated exclusively via the command line. I tried this on two macOS computers that had the same macOS version and were otherwise pretty identical in terms of technology, processors, and so on. One was 16 inches, and the other was the smaller 14 inches, I think. On one, it worked. On the other, I couldn't get Kollima to run. Why, I don't know, so I'm using the computer on which I'm recording this video now, Docker. On another computer, I have Kollima running. No idea why it works on one and not on the other. I really can't tell you. Try it out yourself. You can simply stick to these installation instructions. If you want to use Docker, you can install it via Homebrew, for example. Homebrew is a technology that provides a kind of package manager for macOS, as you know it from Linux systems, or you can just download it from the Docker website. Both are possible. I think I took the download version back then. You can simply go to docker.com and download the app for your operating system. For me, it's for an Apple chip. You can also download Intel chip, Windows, Linux apps, and simply install them as normal. There's no secret to it. You just install it. And I would just say follow the tips here to test if it all works. If you work with WSL2 under Windows, you have to take a look. I would just stick to the instructions here. I did that. It worked. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the comments. I don't know if I can answer them because I'm not a Windows user, but maybe someone else can see the video and read the comments and answer them. Or come to my public Discord. It's also linked if you have any problems there. Well, now that Docker is installed on your system, you go to the next step, the DDEV installation. It's also very well described. For macOS, it's easiest to install the whole thing via Homebrew. That's just one command, as we see here. Homebrew, you can find it here. I can show you. Homebrew is this package manager from Exa, and you can simply install it on your terminal or in your terminal by this command here. So you just have to open the terminal app. It's included with macOS. Or maybe you've also installed iTerm2 or something. And then you just run this whole command here, and that's it. It takes a while, but a lot is downloaded. But then Homebrew is installed and can be used. If we look at this example here, or here, in this case, DDEV, you see this name convention. DDEV update can then simply be done with brew upgrade DDEV. In the first installation of DDEV, this command is still running here. mxert install. This basically installs SSH certificates so that your local installation of your projects, in this case, our example of TYPO3, is later encrypted with SSL. So just execute these commands, whereby you don't have to do the brew upgrade in the first installation. I would simply recommend doing the steps as they are here. The install script is another alternative. You don't necessarily need it now if you work with Homebrew, which I would recommend. With Linux, the whole thing is a bit easier. Depending on what kind of distribution you use, I have also tested it before. And under Windows, there are actually a few more steps necessary, depending on whether you are now working with WWSL2 or not. But, as I said, just run them step by step. Decide which version you are using here, Docker Desktop or this Docker Insight. Just follow the steps as they are here. That worked flawlessly for me with my only test with Windows. When Docker and DDEV are installed, then you can start the Docker app. And I'll show you what it looks like for me now. It's already running for me now. This is the Docker interface for me now. This is what it looks like for me on the Mac. It may be that it looks a bit different on Windows or Linux, I can't tell you now. But in principle, as soon as you start Docker, if you use the Docker Desktop app, this window appears here. And the only thing you have to do is maybe go into the settings at the beginning. That's the gear symbol up here. And what I've changed here, although it may not be the perfect setting, it works for me like this, that I've changed this file sharing implementation to Virtuo FS. Although this is not necessarily recommended in the documentation, I have now heard from other users that this is actually a bit more performant here. I then changed it for testing, so there were no problems. So you just have to test whether it works for you. And the resources, it depends a bit on what kind of computer you have. I have now released 4 CPU cores for Docker. I would have 16 gigabytes of storage in this computer. I have now reserved 6 gigabytes for Docker, so to speak. If you have more storage, 32 gigabytes, 64 gigabytes, you can of course also release more RAM for Docker. And the swap file here, so a data exchange, I'm just wondering that I had it at 512. I thought I would have set it to 0, but it's okay. Interesting is maybe this virtual disk limit here. This is now set to 85 gigabytes for me. Docker also needs a kind of virtual hard drive. All the images, containers, have to be stored and executed somewhere. And that's this here. But you can increase the size at any time. I think shrinking is a bit more difficult, but you can increase it at any time. You can adjust that here. Then you have to restart Docker, and then this virtual hard drive has more space. You have to keep an eye on it a bit, or Docker keeps an eye on it if the space here should be tight. And depending on the size of your hard drive, depending on the available space on your hard drive, you can of course adjust it accordingly. Of course, it also depends on the projects you use or what you do with it. For me, that's been enough so far. Otherwise, I don't think I've said anything else here. It's all here on standard, if I'm not mistaken. I just have to look through it again. No, that's actually all right. I thought there would be an adjustment somewhere regarding Docker Compose, but I don't find it anymore. Maybe it was only necessary in earlier versions. No, then that's basically it. If we look here, no, everything's fine. Well, Docker is running now. I can see that here. This button is green here. You can also see that in most tasks. You can't see it here in the screen recording. A little tip on the performance of DDEV. Let's go into the documentation here for macOS, and I think now I have to see if that's the same for Windows. Exactly. For macOS and Windows, this mutagen is recommended here. That gives a real performance boost. Afterwards, you can activate that globally by simply letting this command run on the shell, but you can also turn it off globally and only activate it on the project level. That works too. But I would recommend activating that here. If there are problems with you, I've heard from some of them rarely now. So really, in rare cases, you can also turn it off globally again with disabled, if it should cause any problems for you. So Docker and DDEV are running now, and now we want to install TYPO3 12. To do this, I go to the website get.typo3.org, and there you will find all the information you need to install TYPO 3.12. A look at the system requirements. PHP 8.1 is the minimum. This is relevant afterwards when we set up our local development environment with DDEV. Database system MariaDB 10.3 or MySQL 8, upwards each. You can also set that in DDEV, modern browser I assume, and we don't need to look at the rest so closely, because DDEV does that pretty well. We just have to adjust a little. If we go to get version 12 now, we will find several options to install TYPO 3. The first is also the same setup, a new project via DDEV and Composer. That's exactly what we want to do. But you also see other methods, the classic one via wget, or you can actually also download a target set or zip archive. This is the so-called classic way where you have to work with symlinks, but I will of course limit myself to DDEV and Composer. If we look at this here, then you will find a few commands that you can basically execute like this. So you can put a directory somewhere on your computer in the terminal, in the shell, so the directory should be empty, and then you can just execute these commands one after the other. This DDEV config command sets up the configuration for a DDEV project, so to speak. And we can also assign a few parameters to it. For example, that it is a TYPO 3 project, or that the so-called document root is the folder public. It will be created right away with this command. And we set the PHP version to 8.1 with this command here. Then a Composer project is created via DDEV Composer create. And this is created by this package TYPO 3 CMS-based distribution. And here the minimum version 12.4 is also set. Then it is installed. Then DDEV has to be restarted once. This is connected to a change in TYPO 3.12, which concerns the file's local configuration and additional configuration. Then the installation is prepared with this first install file, and then DDEV is started in the browser. You can do it all like this. I do it a little differently. And I would like to show you the other way now, because you just have to copy-paste in an empty directory. So that's no secret. Just copy-paste the commands. I'm going to do it a little differently, as I said. This is where this so-called base distribution is used. This is a meta package where certain TYPO 3 packages are defined. What should be installed, but that often doesn't fit with what I want. So I want to have it in my hand, which TYPO 3 packages are installed. Maybe I also want to install one or two additional extensions. And that's why I don't do it this way, but I go to the Composer Helper menu here. And here I can click together which TYPO 3 packages, which system extensions I want to install. I can click together manually here, and then I see that the right Composer command is created up here. You also have such presets here. Full, minimal, and default. If I click full, then everything is offered to me for installation. With minimal, only the minimal system, so that TYPO 3 works at all, so that I can get to the back end. But there is nothing there that is helpful for the front-end output. So fluid style content, for example, as a system extension, is not included here at all. And TYPO 3 default, that's what you get when you download the target set or zip archive, for example. There are just some extensions that are not included, for example, the front-end login extension or the advanced file metadata index search and so on. You may have to decide for yourself what you need in your project or what you don't need. Of course, as a beginner, you can't make a bad decision if you don't know the system yet. That's why I would recommend you at this point, just click full, then you have all the system extensions and you can reinstall them at any time later. If you notice, okay, I don't need them at all. But for the beginning, just click full, and then over time, you will learn what you need and what you don't. You can also change the TYPO 3 version here. You see, you can even go down to TYPO 3, 8. Of course, these are not the ELTS versions that you can install here. They are mandatory, but you can install the latest or the last free version, so to speak here. If we now change this to 9, then the last free version of 9.5 will be installed here, but that's not the ELTS version, unless you have access to the chargeable ELTS repository, just as a little hint. Of course, we'll stay with TYPO 3.12 now, and we'll need that command later, but now I'm going to start a terminal program here first to show you how I would proceed here. This is now my terminal on my MacBook, that is on my local computer. First, I create an empty directory, or I go to a subdirectory. This is called htdocs for me. I have all my projects in there, but that's optional. Now I'm going to create a new directory here with the command mkdir. I'll just call it TYPO3 12 demo. Switch in there and we'll see that it's empty now. And now I'm going to execute this ddef config command first. You see, I'm still being suggested a car completion here. I'll go straight to it. First, I'll run ddef config without any further parameters. And now I'm asked for the project name. The project name is part of the URL over which this local project can be called in the browser. And that's just the name of the directory I'm in right now. So TYPO3 12 demo. I can either confirm with enter or just type in another name here. Then document root. So what is the directory that will be called in the browser, so to speak? When I open the URL in the browser, that will be where the index.php is located. This is currently the current directory. I'm going to confirm everything now. And you can already see that different project types can now be supported. Since I haven't prepared anything further yet, here is the project type PHP. That means I can now also develop some PHP applications as normal if I want to. I'm just going to confirm that now. And now let's see what happens. Now a ddef was created here. And if we go in there, a lot has happened here now. The only thing that interests us in this development at the moment is the file configs YAML. This is a text file in YAML format, and that's the configuration for this one project. If we look at it here now, then we see some parameters here. For example, the name, the project type, the document root. I also see PHP version 8.0 as standard, so that wouldn't fit right now. The web server type is Nginx. ddef supports Nginx and Apache. We will use Apache later because that's usually the server that is used on most real servers or hardware servers, and there are a few more parameters. I'm not going to go into that now. We don't need that for this first step yet. I would also like to mention the documentation down here. You can see here, for example, which PHP versions are supported by ddef. It starts with version 5.6 and then goes up to 8.2 at the moment, at least at the time of recording this video. It may also be that if you see the video a few weeks or months later that PHP 8.3, 8.4, I don't know what PHP version is still supported, but I'm going to go out here again and I'm going to delete it all again because for TYPO3, I want to do it a little differently. So I'm going to delete this ddef directory again, and my source directory is empty again. I'll start again now. I've defined a shortcut here on the Mac. I'll just run that for a moment. And now you can see that a command is being issued to me, which I want to execute like this, namely ddef config. But I can already make a few settings using all these parameters. I say, for example, for the project I want to activate mutagen, it is activated globally for me, but I still like to put it into the config YAML. If I pass this YAML file on to someone who also wants to install the same project for themselves and mutagen is not activated globally, you could do it like this, for example. Then I have set PHP version to 8.1 as standard for this command. I would now like to use MariaDB in version 10.7. The project type is TYPO3. I set the time zone for the virtual server here to Europe, Berlin. This ensures that in my virtual server, the same time is the same date as on my normal MacBook. That this is synchronous. Otherwise, there can be deviations here. Using this parameter, WebImage extra packages, I install a few Linux packages that I often need in TYPO3 projects. For example, Graphics Magic for image processing. And these three tools here, Popular Utils, CatDoc, and UnRTF, I simply install if I want to use search extensions like the indexed search, for example. This provides tools to index PDF files or Word documents and various other things. You need that if you use indexed search, for example. I set the web server type to Apache. The document root should be folder public. This is standard in a TYPO3 Composer installation. And I also say here with this create doc root, please create this folder right now. I set the Composer version to version 2. You could also work with Composer 1 in ddef. Composer 2 is, however, standard. I think I wouldn't need to specify this parameter here because version 2 is set as standard. And this is also pretty cool. I can use environment variables using the parameter web environment. And here I put the TYPO3 context, the application context, on the development mode, the developer mode. This has various advantages. My system is then locally in development mode. I can query this in the typo script, for example. There are various methods where this is useful. For example, I can turn off compression from CSS, JavaScript, and so on in the development context. But on the live system, it is automatically active, and a few other little things you can use. I'll just run the command with enter, and now I'm not asked for all these parameters like just now. Don't ask me what the project should be called, what type of project, and so on, because I've already specified everything here, and now a little more has happened. Next to the folder DDEV, a folder public was created, and if we look at the YAML file again, then we see all the information I had in this command. We see PHP is 8.1, Apache is used. Here I have these extra packages, context, and so on. So that's what I usually use. Of course, every now and then I adjust it. If I want to work with PHP 8.2, then you can change it at any time and restart DDEV. So I'll go out again and run a DDEV start. Now the DDEV project is being run. That takes a while, and if you run it for the very first time, it may take a while. Now I have to enter an admin password again because an adjustment or supplement is made in the local hosts file so that the call to the local domain works afterwards. As I said, it can take a little longer the first time. It may also be that DDEV, or rather Docker, downloads some Docker images so that the Apache server, the MySQL, or MariaDB database works, and so on. That can take a few minutes depending on how fast your internet is. We'll just wait for this process to finish. It doesn't download anything from me now because I already have it on my computer. That's why it should be relatively fast. Okay, now the project has been started. We don't see anything in the terminal here, but we'll just keep going and install TYPO3. Okay, now I go back to the browser and I said I wanted to have this full version of TYPO3.12. And I just copy this command up here, this composer require, into my clipboard. I go back to the terminal, and if I were to just insert this command like this, it wouldn't actually work. We have to run that within DDEV. That's why I'm writing DDEV now, and then Command or Control V, I'm inserting this command. So the whole thing has to be called DDEV composer require. And now I'm going to run it all. This can take a while now. It's going relatively fast for me now, because I already have it all in cache. If you do this for the first time, then of course all these packages would be downloaded. That takes a few seconds. Let's just keep going. I have to confirm this query here with yes. This one too. And now the installation is running. As I said, it takes a little longer for the first time. It's going relatively fast for me now, and now we have to do a DDEV restart. I'll explain why in a moment, but this is an important step. Don't forget it. DDEV restart basically drives the project down and restarts it again. And that's important so that DDEV can recognize the TYPO3 version used and configure it accordingly, I would say. There is a change in version 12 of TYPO3. The configuration files where, for example, the access data to the database is located are no longer in the folder TYPO3 conf and are no longer called local configuration and additional configuration, but they are now in the folder config system, at least in the composer installation, and are called settings and additional.php. And DDEV creates a corresponding file so that the system can communicate with the database from the Docker container. We can also see here now that the container has been started. TYPO3 does not seem to have been installed yet. The settings .php is still missing in the folder config system settings. Yes, that's right. But DDEV has now created the additional TYPO3 for the database connection. And that only works through this restart. If I had now installed a TYPO3.11 or older, then it would not have created the additional .php, but the file additional configuration.php in the folder TYPO3 conf. This is important so that the correct configuration file is created. And now we can start the whole thing. If I now run DDEV launch, the project is simply started in the browser. And we see that this does not work yet. This is also the note that we saw earlier, because in the first installation, we need this file first install in the document tool. And that is this command that I still have to execute now. DDEV exec touch public first install. That means I put a file with the name first install in the folder public. I also let it run. It does not have to have any content. It just has to be there and with exactly this name. So not something with a small lettering. But as we have now written here, I go back to the browser and let it reload again. Now I see no problems detected. Continue. I am not asked for the database access data because that is in the additional PHP. And now I can enter my username and password here. You have to put a little more brain fat in there than in older TYPO3 versions. There are also password policies in TYPO3.12. So how secure does a password have to be? I can now optionally leave an email address here and can also give the whole thing a name. Continue. Then it takes a moment again. And now TYPO3 was installed. I can now decide whether I want to create an empty start page with a bit of rudimentary typo script, or do I just want to go straight to the back end. I always choose this option here and can now log in with the username and password that I just gave. And now TYPO3.12 is installed and I can start setting up my project locally. And that's actually all. When I'm done at some point, I can of course also go back down to DDEV. So go down the project with DDEV stop, can then turn off the computer and just go back up with DDEV start the next day, and can continue exactly at the point where I stopped the day before. That's actually all. And yes, it took a few minutes now because I've explained a lot now. But if you've done that a few times, then TYPO3 is installed in a way in, I'll say, 2 to 3 minutes. Because then I don't have to talk so much. Then you copy and paste, enter the commands you need, and then it's installed super fast. You can even speed it up a bit by installing the TYPO3 console right away and then running the installation directly on the shell. That works too. You can even automate the whole thing with a small script. Then it goes even faster. So it's very easy and works without any problems. I've been using this technique for a few years now. I can only recommend it. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the comments. Now, I would say just try it out, see if it works for you. It works for most of them. So if something doesn't work for you, then the problem may be in front of the computer. Now, I would of course like to get a thumbs up if you liked the video. And if you subscribe to the channel, that would be pretty cool too. And then maybe we'll see each other in a future video. Take care. See you then.